I don't want to say too much other than I'll start out by saying there's a connection between NASA Langley and Johnson, which maybe a lot of you that are older know about, that the first director of Johnson came from Langley. He was longtime Langley Bob Gilruth, and he became the first director of the Johnson from 61 to 72. And then we've heard of Chris Kraft, who came from Langley, who worked in his clean group, and he was responsible as flight director for Mercury and Gemini. And then Gene Kranz also came from Langley, and he worked during the Apollo missions. And so now we have Paul Dye. He didn't come from Langley. He came from Minnesota, of all places. Although Gilruth, who was the first director, also came from Minnesota. So there's a little Minnesota connection. Turned out that I'm not going to go into his history, but I had a little video there that shows how he is very interested in aircraft. I think he has 5 experimental aircraft that he's working with, and he has his own hangar building right near his house there out in Nevada. So he has a very interest in flight, so much so that he's consulting and helping some of the smaller companies that build aircraft. And it so happens my son also is. And that's how I found out about Paul Dye as a potential speaker, because our board and executives at LAA were concerned about the shutdown. And we thought we have a speaker that is from NASA that wouldn't be allowed to talk. So then I asked Paul if he would fill in if we had a problem, and he said he'd be more than happy. So that's the connection. And I did it through my son because they were flying together, the two Pauls. My son is Paul, and they were flying one of these aircraft. And he asked him then and said, sure, he'd be happy. So anyway, that's kind of the background. He went to the University of Minnesota in aeronautical engineering. After, I think, when he was 15 or so, or maybe less, he was flying airplanes and got his license. So he's big into aviation. And you talk about flying the shuttle. He really did, fly on the ground with the simulators and all. And he worked with the astronauts. And so they use the term out there, apparently, that the flight director flies the shuttle, because, it's more like he's in control of the shuttle. So anyway, well, that's kind of set up the background, and I think we're very fortunate that he was willing to come. And he made a little comment that if the government lets us down, he'll come and help us out. So, well, fortunately, the government didn't shut down, but we had him waiting in the wings, and so I look forward to hearing from him. That's all I have to say.
Thanks very much. And yes, of course, there is a big connection between Langley and JSC. I mean, Langley was always the mother organization. But let's talk a little bit about of what we did over all these years. So it's really great to be here. I'm happy to fill in for the potential government shutdown. I'm glad it didn't happen, but we'll see how that goes in another 30 days or so. It's been over 10 years since I retired from NASA now, and it's almost been 12 years since we last flew a space shuttle. It was an amazing flying machine, and it's still the record holder for the fastest and highest flying human crewed winged vehicle. And, it came back it was designed back in the 1970s, so it's getting to be kind of an old technology. But I think it's still worth sharing the story of the machine and the people that operated this thing. So I've been flying for about 50 years now, a little more than 50 years. I started out in J3 Cubs. I'm an aeronautical engineer. I'm a commercial pilot. I guess people call me a test pilot because I do test a lot of airplanes. I'm an A&P mechanic. The FAA is dragging me back into the government service a little bit to be a designated airworthiness representative to license experimental aircraft. And yes, I was a crewed human spaceflight flight director for longer than anybody else in history. So I started out with NASA in 1980 as a co-op student, and was a flight controller for about 13 years before I was selected as a flight director. and served in that position for 20 years. So this is kind of some of the stories of that. For people who, you all are insiders, you're NASA people, so you probably already know what the flight director is. But for outsiders, I usually tell people that if they go back to that movie, the Apollo 13, the guy in the white vest and the crew cut, Gene Kranz, sitting in the middle of the room, that was the flight director in Apollo, and that's what we did for Shuttle. And my call sign, the Chris Kraft was red flight, and John Hodge was blue, and Gene Kranz was white flight, which is why he always wears a white vest. That became a tradition. The flight directors choose a call sign. They ran out of colors. Somebody picked gold and silver, got us into the minerals. I'm known as Iron Flight because I come from the Iron Ranges of northern Minnesota, and so sometimes you'll see me identified on the web as Iron Flight. So yeah, I got my start with airplanes very early. I was building and flying model airplanes and model rockets, and then got the opportunity to start working on real airplanes when an Explorer post was founded out in one of the local airports, and rebuilt some J3 Cubs and learned to fly in them. I was kind of a hangar bum at the FBO, and got to fly in all sorts of different airplanes before I got old enough to get a license. And I realize today that really adults were subsidizing my way into aviation, and they were paying a lot of the bills that allowed me to rent a J3 Cub for $5 an hour and get about $4.50 an hour for the gas and oil, and get an instructor for $5 an hour. So I try to give back as much as I can now to aviation to get more young people in. When I was in college, I planned to build airplanes. I did not expect to be in the space program, but I have since gotten to fly an awful lot of them. I've got about 160 or 180 different types of airplanes I've been able to fly in my life as pilot in command, and there are some on this little montage that are very interesting, and some of them that have tried to kill me, and I try not to badmouth too many of them, but most airplanes have their characteristics, and they're a lot of fun to go out and fly. I ended up at NASA because I was planning to work for a little Blanca Aircraft Corporation in Minnesota when I was in college, and they went bankrupt when I was a junior in college, and I didn't realize at the time that that's just the way aviation works. They go bankrupt, they come back, they go bankrupt, and they come back. So I was kind of crushed there, but I applied to be a NASA co-op down in Houston because somebody put a little thing on the bulletin board about it. I had no idea what I was going to do. They accepted me, and it said report to building 111, the badge office at such and such a date, such and such a time. And when I showed up, I didn't know what I'd be doing, and they ended up putting me in mission control, in mission operations, based not on my GPA, which was not stellar, but it was okay, but based on my background, which was that I'd already been a pilot in high school, and then I was working my way through college as a diver, a professional diver. And so they basically later said that, well, you kind of knew what it was like to take personal risks, and so we wanted those kind of people to be making decisions. And so whether you're flying spacecraft or flying airplanes, it's all flying. But when I left NASA, I was asked to take over Kit Planes magazine, which is the magazine, a premier magazine in the world for experimental aircraft. And so I told them I didn't know anything about running a magazine, but they said that's okay. We want a subject matter expert, and I figured I could fool them for a year or two, but it turned out that I did that for 7 years before I needed a bit more of a break, and became editor at large. So now I travel around the world doing whatever I want, and I don't have to produce the magazine, but I produce a lot of content for it. So let's see. I've got, as Olaf said, I've got five. Actually, I got 6 airplanes now, and I won't show you all of them. This is one of my fun little ones. It's a little subsonics single seat, single engine jet. And we fly that. I got about 200 hours on that. It's a fun little machine to fly. And then the one that we just finished, and we're just finishing up flight testing on right now, is an aluminum motor glider. But what's interesting about this is that instead of building it with the little gas engine, we put an electric motor in it. So it's got an electric motor with battery. And so I feel like, once again, I'm doing a little bit of pioneering engineering And it flies well. It's not a great glider, but about 24-to-1, something like that. So the nice thing about an electric power plant is you can run it at low power settings and increase your L over D, your effective L over D, by cheating a little bit when you go looking for thermals. So that's kind of enough about airplanes. Let's talk about the space program. Before I talk about some of the experiences I had, I always want to bring up the fact that it's all about teamwork. As you all know, working at Langley, nobody does this all by themselves. It's a big team effort. When you see Mission Control Houston, you see about a dozen people in the front room. What you don't see is all the people in the back rooms that are supporting those people, and all the people in the computer world that are running the building and the network around the world and the satellite things, and all the engineering support people that are doing the in the mission evaluation room, the program engineers. So it's thousands of people. And I like to tell the story that at the end of a mission, near the end of a mission, a box would arrive on the flight director console from the astronaut office, and it was a box of patches, mission crew patches. And those came from the crew themselves. They paid for them, and they gave them to us to pass out to all the team members. And on my flight control team, nobody got a patch until Olga got her patch. Olga was a very, very important person to us. She was our janitor. And Olga kept Mission Control livable. She kept the crumbs off the floor and emptied the pizza boxes and the Coke bottles out of the trash cans. And she was just as important as the flight director for making the overall mission work. And so while I'm going to talk about my experiences in this program, it's just reflective of the kind of things that we got from all of these people that made a team work. Let's see. Here we go. So when I showed up in Mission Control in 1980, it was still the old control center that had been used for Gemini and Apollo. It was very dumb consoles connected to big mainframe computers in the basement or in the first floor. The old green consoles that we had basically had black and white TV monitors and hardwired push buttons and lights. And if you needed to change what a light did or what something did on your display, you had to fill out paperwork to get the computer punch cards changed, and it took about 6 months to get a little bit of a function change on your console. So it was pretty tedious. We ended up building the new control center based on microcomputers and distributed processing and things like that, and all the smart people that we hired well long after me that knew how the computers worked built a lot of capability. We were always working towards what we called the office MIPSer, or multipurpose support room. We wanted to get all the people out of the back rooms and back in the office working on advanced programs and projects. And I said, and so we were looking for a distributed architecture for the control center where the people in the office could call up data and look at it in the office if the folks in the front room needed a consultation. And I said, you're really not thinking big enough. I said, we don't need an office MIPSer. What we need is a mountain cabin MIPSer, where literally you can be sitting anywhere in the world and bring up the data and call into the control center and tell them what you're seeing. And today, that's what we really have. You can bring the data up anywhere and look at it. We had, back in the old days, we had pneumatic tubes to send paper around the building if you needed to communicate to your back room on your floor or one of the other floors. They're like the old department store pneumatic tubes. You pop in 3 ounces of paper, no more than 3 ounces of paper, and that was all you're supposed to use. But of course, we were engineers, so we had to test the system. And there was the day that somebody in the front room needed some pencils, and he asked his back room for some pencils, and they put a handful of number 2 wooden pencils in the carrier and sent it off, and the carrier opened up en route, and 20 years later they were still picking slivers of wood and graphite out of the system when it was clogging things up. And then there's the incident where a sandwich was sent, and the sandwich got lost somewhere en route, and I'm never sure they did find that. So it was good times in the old days in mission control. Let's see. So I became a flight controller. I showed up with a background in flight testing and aircraft design. I was a silk scarf and goggles kind of guy, leather helmet, leather jacket, and they said, "You're perfect. We're exactly what we need. We're going to assign you to the Space Lab computer system." The Space Lab was a package of experimental support stuff that sat in the payload bay, and the first thing they did was assign me to the computer system, which I discovered that the Space Lab computers had the exact same microprocessor as the Atari 400 game console. And so I went out and bought one with the travel money that they'd reimbursed me when I moved, and taught myself machine language programming because I kind of had to learn that. And after I was responsible for those computers, they said, great, now we're going to put you in charge of the instrument pointing system, the Space Lab instrument pointing system, which was a set of gimbals and gyros and optical sensor package, star trackers, which pointed telescopes. This big telescope was mounted on it and mounted in the payload bay. And just because we can commiserate as a bunch of old retired people here, it's really fascinating when you go to you show up at the Smithsonian at the Udvar Hazy, and you walk around the back of a space shuttle and you see the equipment, the instrument pointing system that you used to work on sitting in the Smithsonian. It just kind of makes you feel a little bit older than you really are, but that's where it ended up. So it was a pretty neat system. And after I did that, we were getting ready for its second flight when we lost the Challenger. And at that point, my management said, okay, you've done enough on this payload support stuff. We want you over on the orbiter. And so I moved over to the mechanical systems section, where I became responsible for a lot of the landing and deceleration equipment on the orbiter. Did a lot of development with the drag chute, because if people don't remember, we didn't have a drag chute at the beginning of the program. We added that back in after Challenger. The landing gear was undersized. The wheels, the tires weren't speed rated enough. The brakes didn't work. The nose wheel steering just flat out didn't work because we were afraid of it. So we worked on a lot of those things, and I did a lot of test flying in the simulators on good landing techniques and failure recovery, things like that. And I became an ascent entry flight controller. I like to tell a story that during the very first the first launch attempt for the Hubble Space Telescope, I was the MAX officer in the mission control. I was responsible for the APUs and the hydraulics. And we started the APUs at about 4 minutes prior to launch, and we were looking at the traces of the chamber pressures, and it was a bang bang controller. So the controller of the valve would open up the valve and squirt in some hydrazine, and that would decompose in a catalyst bed and make hot gas and spin the turbine wheels. And then as it closed the valve, it would spin down, and then it would sense that, it would open the valve. So it was a little pop. And we were watching the heartbeat on this thing on a strip chart recorder, and it just didn't look right. And the Cape asked us whether we were go or not, and they said it didn't violate any of their criteria. We looked at it, and I wasn't happy with it, and I told my flight director that I thought we were no go. And so we scrubbed the launch, and it turned out when they took it apart that the valve seat had broken, and that APU probably would have failed in the first couple of minutes of launch, and we would have ended up with a return to launch site abort, which would have saved the crew in the vehicle, but probably have destroyed the Hubble. And so the next morning, I was sitting in my office, my cubicle in the office bullpen, and in walked, let me just say, a very high-level senior administrator from the center, from JSC, who sat down. It was just him and I in a room, and he said, "Young man, you just earned every dollar that NASA is ever going to pay you for the rest of your career." And that's the kind of calls that flight controllers get to make, and it probably was true, because we saved the Hubble from destruction. So they suggested that I apply for flight director, and I did, and I interviewed and was told, "Thank you very much. We're glad you're interviewed, but you're not ready. But we wanted you to go through the process." And then they made me a section head, and I was a section head. I think they call them group leads now at JSC, but we call a section head. And again, they said, "We need you to apply to be flight director next time around." And so I applied, and they said, "Thank you very much, but this isn't your turn yet." And then what a funny thing happened. We were asked to start looking at Russian space hardware and the Russian space program. This was in 1992, right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I was a section head, and I'd kind of distributed my work out to all the people in the team, so everybody did their work. And so I had a little bit of spare time, and they asked me to get smart on the Russian space hardware. And so I did, and then they asked me to go to Moscow with a few folks and sit down with the Russians, because we had determined that the Russian space program was operating with no money, and they had a lot of smart people who were going to go to the highest bidders, and those highest bidders wanted to build nuclear tip ballistic missiles in various places around the globe that were not friendly to the United States, and it was to our advantage to get them working on peaceful space programs again. So we kind of partnered with the Russians, and we sat down with them, and they said, well, we've got this space station, but you bankrupted us before we could get our space shuttle done. And you guys have a space shuttle, but you can't figure your act together to build a space station. So how about you fly your space shuttle to our space station? We thought that sounded like a good idea, and it satisfied the presidential directive that we worked together with them. And so we created Shuttle Mir. Now, the interesting thing about working with individual Russians, and by the way, I want to say that I am absolutely appalled at what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I have no support for that whatsoever. It's amazing to me that we're still flying the ISS with the Russians with the things that are going on. But we all have worked within and without politics, and so I'm not going to be an apologist for what Russia's doing these days. But individual Russians are people, and it turns out that individual Russians, their culture is that they don't just want to work with whoever happens to be in the position at the time. They want to work with Paul because they've worked with Paul before, and they've drank with Paul before, and they've eaten with Paul before, and they've invited him to their apartment before. And that kind of gave me a leg up. So the next flight director selection, when we were going to start flying to the Russian Mir space station, it became quite obvious that Paul needed to be a flight director. And so I was selected in 1993. And we ended up flying the space shuttle to the Mir space station 10 times. I was there. I was on the 9 of those missions as flight director, and it was quite an interesting program. Of course, when I was selected as a flight director, it's kicked off a year of very intense training. So I was selected with 2 other people, my classmates. We selected about 1 flight director a year, but we did it about every 3 years. So you always had a couple of training partners. You do about 6 months of academics, classroom work, a lot and lots of small simulator training, big simulator training, a lot of exercises in suits and everything, because we want to fully understand what the crew's going through. And then we get into the Mission Control Center and we do simulations, 8-hour simulations. You generally had 1 a week for yourself, and then you spent another 2 days sitting and watching your training partner sim, because you can learn as much by watching as you can by doing. When you fly a mission, it takes basically 4 teams to fly a mission. You need or 4 flight directors. You need the 3 to do the around-the-clock operations, 9-hour shifts basically with an hour of overlap. And then you need to have 1 team that specializes in the ascent and the entry. At any one time in the office, in the flight director office, we had between 10 and 12 flight directors, and we were leapfrogging missions. So you were always working. One of the orbit flight directors is the lead flight director for the mission, who's given the mission about 1.5 years in advance and told, here's an orbiter, here's the mission number, here's a crew, and here's the payload. Go make it happen. And so you then corral all the thousands of people you need to plan the mission, train for the mission, go fly the mission, and then debrief the mission and build the lessons learned after that. I was lead flight director for 9 shuttle missions. I was on 39 missions as a flight director on at least one of the teams. So I ended up flying an awful lot. And I was fortunate to be able to fly out of the old Mission Control Center back when I had hair. And you can start seeing, a lot of the traditions went away, but I flew a couple of missions out of the old control center before we built the new one. This is an interesting picture. I always like to point this one out. This is an actual picture. This is not a computer simulation. It was taken from a Soyuz spacecraft, and we had a European astronaut. He lived in Houston, but he was a European astronaut. And he was coming. They were repositioning, or no, they were coming home in the Soyuz while we were docked. And so they had undocked, and we'd asked him to take this picture for us. And then we said, and once you've taken the picture, take the data card out of the camera and put it in your flight suit pocket, because we knew that if it stayed in the camera all the way through entry, when that thing was sitting on the plains of Kazakhstan, the Russians were going to get there and they were going to get their hands on that camera. And the first thing that the Russians learned after the breakup of the Soviet Union was capitalism. And they learned really, really quick that everything had value. And we really wanted this picture. So we wanted to make sure that that was in our guys' jacket, flight suit pocket, so that we could get the picture without having to pay for it from the Russians. But that was a real picture of the orbiter docked to the space station. One of the things about flying to a space station is that it's very, very flexible. All of these, I know you guys live on the water up there, and so you're familiar with no wake zones. Well, all of these solar arrays are very, very delicate, and the thrusters from an orbiter or any spacecraft will put out plumes, which are like wakes, which can damage the arrays. And so when you approach a space station, you need to use a combination of jets where you're not pointing the jets directly at the station. That means that about half the jets you can't use, and that means that you have very, very little redundancy for failures. And my very, very first shift as a flight director was STS 63. It was the first time we were going to rendezvous with the Mir space station. We weren't going to dock. We were going to rendezvous and fly around it. So I was the planning team flight director, which is when the crew's asleep, and we came on about 6 hours after launch, and that was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon Houston time. The interesting thing about that time is about 5 o'clock is when all of the senior level managers, before they went home for the day, would stop by the control center to see what's going on. So I had gotten in and I'd sat down and I'd taken the handover from my counterpart, the ascent flight director, and he noted that they had lost a couple of jets. They'd had to close the manifolds on a couple of jets because they were leaking. And that put us kind of zero fault tolerant. Well, we took over. I signed for the orbiter. The previous team left. And my prop officer called me and said, "Flight, we've got another leaking jet." And I said, "What do the rules say we need to do?" And the bottom line was we needed to close the manifold. And that was going to cost us the jets that we needed to rendezvous with the Mir. And that was kind of one of the big items of the mission. Well, I realized that behind me, there was a row of people that had all been sitting at one time in their career in my chair. There was Gene Kranz, the director of mission operations. There was Randy Stone, the director of shuttle mission operations. There was Lee Briscoe, the chief of the flight director office. There was Gary Cohen, the lead flight director for the mission. Then there were the other two flight directors working the mission with me. And they had a whole lot more experience than I did because this was my very first official shift as a flight director. So I stood up, I turned around, and I looked at him. And there was dead silence for about 20 seconds. No one said anything. And finally, Randy Stone looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Well, Dye, what the hell are you going to do now?" And I realized that they realized that this was my orbiter. I had signed for it. It was my decision. I had the authority, and they weren't going to take it away from me, even though, they might. And but they'd all been in that seat, and they knew that they didn't want anybody else to take the authority away. So I turned back around. I said, "Ground controller, let's enable the building. Capcom, let's get it ready to wake the crew up. Prop, what switches do we need to throw to close the valves?" I knew that we could be costing us the mission at that point, but it was the only right thing to do. And so we did it. The bottom line was we found a workaround later on that allowed us to get the jets back, and we were able to complete the mission as it was. But those are the kind of decisions you had to make as a flight director. Let's see. I'm going to find my cursor here. There we go. So we flew 9, 10 missions to the Mir, and after working with the Russians for about 4 years, I was kind of burned out on it, more like 8 years. And so I said, "Guys, I'd like a mission that doesn't have to do anything with the Russians before we get into the building of the space station." And so they said, "Great. We got this interesting mission coming up." It was called the STS-99, the Space Radar Topography Mapper. And this was a big radar antenna in the payload bay back here hiding behind the canister. And then another radar antenna out on the end of an extendable 200-foot mast. And they worked together like a binocular vision. To give you a binocular vision, you flew upside down, and in 10 days of flying, we mapped the entire Earth's surface between 62 degrees north and 62 degrees south, every square meter of dirt, with a resolution of 9 meters and an accuracy of 1 meter. We built that topographical map. And again, this was a case of JPL built the experiment and they operated the experiment, and you know, we thought that we might have to jettison this mast because it extended beyond the payload bay, and if it didn't stow, we were going to have to jettison it. Well, we didn't jettison it, but JPL assured me that, you know, they really didn't care if they got the hardware back, because JPL never gets their hardware back. It ends up sitting on the surface of Mars or going outside of the solar system, right? They didn't want their hardware. They wanted the data. And sure enough, one other case, this is up here up in the corner, this is the SRTM mast and canister and outboard antenna hanging up in the Udvar-Hazy in the Smithsonian. And so once again, I ended up with hardware sitting there in the Smithsonian Institution. But that was a great mission. And when people ask me, of all the 39 missions I worked as a flight director, what am I most proud of? I think it probably comes back to SRTM, a mission that most people have never heard of, because this is the database of the entire planet Earth, the topographic map of the Earth, and it will be for the next 100 years. And that's Google Earth right there. That's all kind of data that you need to site cell towers or to dig tunnels or to do anything where you need a good map. So I'm pretty proud of that because it affects everybody's lives. Now, mission control is an interesting place to work. Of course, we're very, very serious all the time. We have a lot of things happening, but that doesn't mean we don't have fun now and again. This was must have been something like the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11 or something, and I told we were working a shuttle mission, and I told all my people, tomorrow is skinny black tie and white shirt day. And so everybody had to show up in dressed like an Apollo flight controller, right? You know, and even the young ladies were playing along, and they wore white shirts and skinny black ties. By the way, buying a skinny black tie these days in Houston, Texas is not an easy thing to find. It's just kind of out of fashion, right? But we did that. And so that was my flight control team that day. I like to stop and pause a little bit and talk about flight directors. So this is a picture of a flight director gathering. We have what we call semi-occasional flight director gatherings. They're never scheduled too far in advance, but every once in a while the call will go out that it's time for a meeting of the Ancient and Honorable Society of Flight Directors, and we'll get together in a room somewhere in Houston. Nobody is allowed in the room if they don't have a flight director call sign. There are no spouses, there are no children, there are no waiters or waitresses, no secretaries, no staff people. It's just flight directors sitting in the room, having a few hors d'oeuvres and talking about the old days. And this was a picture of after one of those gatherings. We were actually dedicating the control center in the name of Christopher Kraft. Right here, and that was Chris, and he was in his 90s at the time. He's wearing a red tie because he was red flight. Gene Kranz is back here on the left, second back from the back. Gene's still around. Gene just put out a new book, by the way. If you're looking for a good book to buy, it's a good book. I also like to point out these two gentlemen here over in the right side of the picture. Because Glenn Lunny here, the second from the right in the front row, was a Langley alumni, as was Chris and Gene. And Glenn Lunny was one of the best flight director mentors I ever had. He was just an incredible guy. We lost him a couple years ago, just like we lost Chris. But what's interesting is that standing next to him is Brian Lunny, his son. He was a legacy. So we had a father-son flight directors in the office, in the history of the office. So you never know. But these kind of gatherings are just fun to get together and find out what people are doing. I go back to Houston once in a while to attend those. Let's see. So the shuttle program lasted about 30 years, and it became clear that we were going to wrap that up. And one of the things we did all the time was generic simulations. So we would do generic simulations to train flight controllers to be flight controllers and essentially get them their licenses. And then we would do flight-specific training. But we did more generic training than anything. And in order to do a big simulation, you needed the control center, and you needed a simulator with a crew, and then you needed all the communications things in between. And they were incredibly realistic. I defied anybody to tell the difference between whether it was real or whether it was a sim. The problem was the last 2 years, we knew we were coming to an end of the shuttle program, And we were having trouble finding astronauts because anybody who was assigned to one of those last couple of missions was training for their mission. If they were not assigned, they were either looking for a job or they were training for space station. And so we couldn't find astronauts to help us with our generic simulations. And so we created a couple of crews of instructors and flight controllers. We call ourselves the astronauts, N-O-T-S. And we were qualified. I was a commander, and I had a crew of flight controllers and trainers. And we'd go over, and it was one of the best times of the whole shuttle program because I'd get to spend a day in mission control as a flight director, training flight controllers and being trained. And then I'd get to spend an 8-hour day in the cockpit as a commander. And then I'd go back to the control center for a day doing evaluations of some sort on flight directors or flight controllers. Then I just had to figure out how to stay out of the office for 2 more days because I just hated the office. The office, nothing fun happened there. You didn't fly, right? And it just meant that you'd end up going to meetings. So we got a lot of time in the cockpit because that's how we understood what the crew was going to be doing on orbit, and it was a great kind of flying to do. The other things that happened in the control center was you always got visits during the flight during flights of interesting people. This was probably one of the close to the last flights of the series of flight directors of shuttle flights. And I'm sitting here. This is Jerry Griffin, who was a flight director back in Apollo. I don't know how many of you know the Texas lore, but the thing we always say about Jerry, who was an incredible flight director, was, did you hear the one about the Aggie flight director who launched a Saturn V into a thunderstorm? That was Jerry. And Apollo 12 got hit by lightning, but he managed to make it work. There's a great story about that. So there were 2 things about leadership that I tell people all the time about that. So they launched Apollo 12. It got hit by lightning right off the pad, and it completely took the whole spacecraft offline. The rocket kept running. The rocket's computers were going and guiding it, but the Apollo spacecraft was all dead. And there was a flight controller on the Eagle console or ECOM console who had seen this signature before in training, and he knew that he needed to throw a switch in the cockpit. And he told the flight director Jerry, he said, "Flight ECOM, we need you to take SCE to aux." And the flight director, Jerry, had no idea what that switch was, not a clue what that switch was. But because he had trained for so many years with this flight controller, he trusted him implicitly. And he said, "Capcom, have him take SCE to aux." There was only one astronaut on board, and that was Al Bean, who knew where that switch was, and it was right in front of him. And he didn't really know what it did, but he just took it and he threw it on. And that took the signal conditioning equipment from normal to auxiliary, and boom, mission control had all its data back, and they could tell what they needed to do to restart the spacecraft. So that's a lesson in leadership trust. You've got to trust your people that you train with them. The second story that comes out of that is that they had an hour and a half to figure out whether they were going to send this spacecraft that had just been hit by lightning to the moon or not. And that was Jerry's job as flight director, to figure out whether it was safe. And that was a pretty expensive proposition, because if they didn't go to the moon, they were going to dump the whole stack, the lunar module and everything, into the ocean and bring the crew home. And Chris Kraft came up behind Jerry. Chris was not the center director, but he was the mission operations director. He came up, put his hand on Jerry's shoulder and said, "Young man, you do not have to go to the moon today." And in saying that, he took all the programmatic pressure, all the political pressure off of the flight director's shoulder and said, "Do the right thing technically." The team did a magnificent job with figuring out that there was nothing wrong with the spacecraft. They'd got it restarted, and they sent them to the moon. But both of those are leadership lessons in how we worked in the space program. Anyways, that kind of a sidebar. That's Jerry. This is Jim Lovell. You might have heard of him, Apollo 13 commander. And Jim was an astronaut in Gemini when they did some of the very first rendezvous. And this is a picture of Jim and I going over the space shuttle rendezvous checklist and comparing notes, how we did rendezvous in Shuttle compared to how they did them in Gemini. And basically, we did them the exact same way because it worked. And why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? We were laughing there a little bit about the fact that we had all sorts of acronyms for the names of various maneuvers or burns in Rendezvous, and we were using the same ones in Shuttle as we used as they used in Gemini, and nobody knew what the names actually stood for, the acronyms. We just had been using them for 30, 40 years. Let's see. So what was the shuttle all about? Shuttle all about was really about building this. The whole point of a space shuttle was to build a space station and to service a space station. The unfortunate thing is we got it all built and finished, and then we retired the shuttle, and we couldn't carry big things up there and back. That was really a political decision more than anything else. But if you haven't had a chance, you got to get out some evening. You can go to the NASA website, put in your location, and it'll send you an email anytime you have a good sighting opportunity. And go out and watch this thing fly overhead. It's the size of a football field. It's monstrous. It weighs 500,000 pounds. It's just it's an incredible thing, and we have had human beings on board that space station now continuously for 22 years. There was a period of time we weren't flying shuttle, and Elon wasn't flying anything up there, and people would come to me and say, when is NASA going to put people in space again? And I said, you realize we've had people in space continuously all the time. We've never had a time when this wasn't staffed since we put the first people at. But I like to go outside here in the desert of the West. I live in a very dark sky area. And I'll get a sighting notification that we've got a pass of the station coming overhead, and I'll go out there in the backyard on our runway. I live on an air park, so I have a runway out there, and a couple of us, my wife and a couple of neighbors, and we'll take a glass of wine, and we'll look at our watches and see it flying overhead, and I raise my glass to the space station, and I say, I built that. Me and a couple of 100,000 of my very best friends, we built that. And it's an amazing thing. It's the brightest star in the sky. If you've never seen it, you need to take time to go see that. So the very last shift that I worked on the space shuttle was a planning shift just before entry of STS-135. The vehicle was buttoned up. There was no planning to do. We were going to hand over to the entry team, and they were going to bring them home. And so we didn't have anything to do that night except to watch the temperatures and pressures and watch the computers tick over and look at the telemetry and make sure that nothing changed. And I'd wandered around to the front of my console here, and I was kind of heads down, and I was kind of nostalgic, and I was talking to a couple of these guys about what it was like in the old days and how we used to use teleprinters and we had such low bit rates that you could practically count the bits one at a time going up and down. And I raised my head after a while after telling a few stories, and I realized that the entire flight control team had gathered around to listen to the old man talk. And I realized then that we had a whole generation of people, most of whom had never been born when were not born when the shuttle flew for the first time. When I became a flight director, I had flight controllers who were not alive when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. And we'd pass that up, and a lot of these guys had never known a time in their lives when a space shuttle wasn't flying. It was a very long program. It was an amazing program. And I said, I had about a year and a half more to retirement, and I was also qualified to fly the space station. And I said, my goal for the next year and a half before I retire is to do every simulation that I could with young flight controllers to make sure that when I walked out the door, I did not take knowledge with me that I had not passed on. The lessons that were taught to me by the Apollo guys, I wanted to make sure that those were passed on to the next generation. And that's what it's all about is generational change. We need to realize that we're in it for the long haul. And it was just, telling new kids about the old days. It was a lot of fun. So a few years ago, I realized that at some point I needed to go ahead and capture some of these stories. And Chris Kraft wrote a book called Flight about the days in Mercury and Gemini. And Gene Kranz wrote a book called Failure is Not an Option about being a flight director during the Apollo days. And I decided we needed a book about the Houston days. So I wrote Shuttle Houston. We released it right when COVID came out, so we couldn't do any book tours, and you couldn't get any time on the news shows because everybody was talking about politics, pandemics, and things like that. But it's out there if you're interested in hearing this or any other stories from the shuttle days. And basically, it's an awful lot of stories of mission control. It's read in all the highest places. I've got a good friend who flies let's say, a very high altitude airplane. Yeah, he's a U-2 pilot. And he said, Paul, I need a copy of your book. I said, okay, here you go. I've signed it for you. Next thing you know, he sent me this picture. He said, I do all my reading above 60,000 feet because that's what he gets up there, and then he got hours of cruise time. So I kind of like that. So I know I'm kind of talking for a while here, and I'm not sure how long I was supposed to talk. But if there's any time if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And it's a pleasure talking to folks that I know spent so much of their lives dedicated to the advancement of aeronautics and aerospace. And it's just wonderful that you all gave me a call, and I'm always happy to chat.
Thanks, Paul. It's very interesting. That's a nice talk, and I liked your slides. Not a lot of words on them.
I learned long ago that if somebody gives me a PowerPoint that's all words, that has every word they're going to say, I just excuse them and say, I'll read it on my own time because I can read faster than they talk. So just pictures. Well,
it's very interesting. And Rick, can you help me with people that might have questions? Was there anything on chat?
Yes, we do have some questions on chat. Mary DeJoseph asks, what is the engine in your electric plane?
Oh, that's a good question. My electric plane is powered by the motor and battery and controller from an electric motorcycle, a Zero motorcycle. It'll put out about 75 horsepower maximum. We cruise at about 60 horsepower.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that has a question? Oh, Mary responded saying, that's amazing.
Good.
Olaf, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I just was interested what it was like to fly with my son.
Oh, he's a very good pilot. I really enjoyed that. Olaf's son is the chief flight instructor at a very large school in Torrance, California. And I'm working on a safety committee for the Experimental Aircraft Association and the FAA to get pilots flying with angle of attack, which is a better way of safer way of flying, angle of attack instrumentation rather than airspeed. And I'm working with Paul, Olaf's son, to get that into his school and to get them collecting data for us. So I really enjoyed flying with Paul. He's a good guy. I'm looking forward to working with him a lot in the future.
Well, he highly recommended you to talk to us Langley people.
Good.
Olaf, I see a finger go up for you.
Well, we don't have the chance often to talk to a flight director here, so I wondered if you could comment on the two that came from Langley before,
Well, yeah,
that
actually,
was Chris Kraft and Jane Krantz. Those two. You've said some
right.
things about them, but what was so special about them that got the things off the ground?
Both of them came out of an aeronautics background, and both of them understood the real-time nature of the job. When you're flying around the Earth at 5 miles a second, you don't have time to stop and think. You need to have thought about what you're going to do in advance. And that is one of the lessons I think that Chris and Gene both brought into mission operations. They created mission control. We were sitting around after one of these flight director gatherings one time on folding chairs in an empty auditorium or an empty conference room late at night. And somebody asked Chris, so when you guys were putting a Mercury together, how did you decide where to put the tracking sites around the globe? What was the spacing of those? And he said, well, in the 1950s, you didn't have radar all over the United States, and if you were flying on an instrument flight plan, you needed to make position reports about every 10 to 15 minutes. And we kind of said, that's what our pilots are used to, making a position call to the ground about every 10 or 15 minutes. So he said, I just told people put a tracking site every 10 to 15 minutes around the ground track of the Earth, and that's where it came from. So very practical guys that instilled a tremendous amount, a sense of duty and responsibility into our people. And those are the tenets of mission control that grew out of those guys.
Damodar Amber had it's not a question, but a comment. He says you had a phenomenal career. Thanks for all your work.
Well, thank you very much. And as you know, it's so fun to talk to people that had NASA careers, because you recognize that it's a privilege and an honor to be given the opportunity to do this stuff. And quite frankly, people ask me sometimes, well, how much did they pay you to do that job? It must have been incredible. And I said, frankly, everybody who worked in mission control would have done it for a sandwich and a cot. I mean, you're there because you love what you're doing, not because of the paycheck. And I think you guys probably recognize that too. All righty. Well, I'm sure you guys have other things to get on to, and I'm happy to say and answer questions, but I don't want to take too much of your time. So thank you very, very much for asking me to chat.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very
Everybody,
much.
I see a lot of hands going up, clapping. So thank you very much. It's a very enjoyable talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also just had a couple more comments in the chat from Mary DeJoseph and Kathy Farrar, and I'm sure they're saying what everybody else is thinking, which is to thank our speaker and that they enjoyed the talk and that it was wonderful.
Okay.
Dick, if I may ask a question.
Yes,
Um,
Dominor.
Yeah, this is actually to Paul. So he mentioned about knowledge transfer he did before his retirement. And I was going to ask Paul, if there are any active mechanisms that are used by the center to tap into knowledge, from folks like you in retirement.
During retirement, not so much, but I have asked. It's not so much a center-wide effort, but I do occasionally get asked when I'm back in Houston for a meeting to stop and chat and visit with flight controllers, trying to give them a sense of what it was like in the old days. And they have numerous videos that I did before I left that they play for the new flight controllers. I kind of got a reputation as being a trainer, the flight director who was very, very interested in training flight controllers. Let's put it that way. And so they videoed a lot of what I did in the old days, and they still show those to new flight controllers. There have been many different attempts at knowledge capture, some with greater success than others, and I've never come to a great. I don't think they've ever come to a perfect solution, but we just all have to pick ways to do it.
Thank you, Paul.